Okay, 9 a.m. Thank you for coming to this plenary session this morning on this rather dull Sunday morning, and in a session that promises to be anything but dull, I would say. My name is Tara Milbrandt, and I will be facilitating this morning. The session is called Understanding Alberta. Why are you laughing? I'm very pleased to introduce Fred Stenson, a prolific and award-winning writer who lives in Cochrane, Alberta. Fred has written over 20 books, fiction and nonfiction, including The Trade, Lightning, and The Great Karoo. His most recent novel, Who by Fire, is rooted in a conflict between an Alberta farm family and a sour gas plant. For 15 years, Fred has directed the Banff Centre's Wired Writing Studio. He has also been Alberta Views magazine's wit columnist since the magazine's inception. So he's going to be speaking for about 45 minutes this morning. Following this, there will be some collective discussion Q&A that I will be facilitating. So please join me in welcoming Fred.
Well, thanks, Tara, and thanks very much to the Parkland for asking me to come here today and allowing me to attend the whole conference, which has been great. So I think I'll just dive right in. So Marshall McLuhan's immensely influential 1964 book about the effects of the new media on global communications was called Understanding Media. Too bad he didn't apply his mighty brain to a really tough question like understanding Alberta. So Mr. McLuhan found, or you could say forged, a kind of logic for understanding media that was accessible to all. His book shed light into some previous darkness, and I'm not sure that I'm up to doing that for Alberta, or that Albertans really want that done. It's the same as the light bulb joke. How many, you name it, I'll say, how many UCP candidates does it take to screw in a light bulb? And the answer, none thanks, we'd rather sit in the dark. Except for some traveling, I've lived my whole life in Alberta. I've been writing for, I guess it's almost 5 decades, and living here all the while, and most of what I wrote was about Alberta. So you'd think I'd know something about the place, but to be honest, of late, I feel like I'm understanding Alberta less well all the time. It appears to be getting weirder, but here's my effort for what it's worth. I'll start with the foundations. The province was born in 1905. You'd think that a place that was becoming a new province in a relatively new dominion would be happy, that its residents would throw their arms around each other and shout, hooray. But no. Calgary, a bustling town on the CPR tracks by 1905, was outraged that Edmonton, smaller and less bustling, was about to be Alberta's capital city. What's more, Edmonton's cross-river companion town Strathcona was getting the provincial university, the University of Alberta, where we stand and sit today. The Battle of Alberta then did not begin with the Flames and the Oilers. It was already there in 1905. The two major towns perceived themselves quite differently and were fighting about that even then. Calgary owed its existence to John A. Macdonald's federal Conservatives, also to a corporation, Canadian Pacific Railway. The Tories and the CPR chose to run the transnational railroad through the Southern Prairie rather than through the old fur trade towns farther north. And suddenly, Calgary was no longer a Mountie fort in the middle of nowhere. Calgary has been corporation and conservative friendly ever since. And what was Edmonton from the first? I would say politically savvy and a bit conniving. Calgary, always hubristic, I love that word, but I can't say it, thought it had the capital thing in the bag. It was so sure it didn't do anything to ensure it. So I remember reading that Calgary's satirical newsman, Bob Edwards, publisher of the Calgary Eye Opener, made regular fun of Edmonton. Edwards wondered what kind of parade they'd put on to celebrate provincehood. A couple of old oxen pulling a cart, people in buffalo coats, fire a few muskets, ha ha ha. But on the surface, Edmonton's claim to be capital did seem a little weak. One of its arguments was that it was the geographical center of Alberta, which it is not. By that standard, the capital should have been Fort Assiniboine or Swan Hills. There's an argument about that. But while Calgary had the CPR and a faster growing city, Edmonton had, besides its supposed geographical centrality, Frank Oliver, formerly proprietor of the Edmonton Bulletin. The newspaperman had been representing Alberta in the Northwest Territories government for 8 years, as well as being an Edmonton booster. He was a Liberal. From 1896 to 1911, Canada was ruled by Wilfrid Laurier's Liberal Party. It was the Laurier Liberals who wrote the legislation creating the twin provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan. Frank Oliver also had a hand in drawing the provinces, Alberta's constituencies. And I've seen a picture of one of those. It had this big chunk, kind of like the head of an octopus in Edmonton. And then it had all these tentacles spreading out into the countryside, very specifically, I suspect. So anyway, not too surprisingly then, the Liberals won the first Alberta provincial election. And the first premier, a Liberal obviously, was Alexander Cameron Rutherford, whose beautiful home is preserved here on the U of A campus. So you see, Alberta was born Liberal, but was ridden by strife, anger, jealousy, and bipolarity, I think, much as it remains today. Now I can see the look of fear on your face as you're thinking, uh-oh, he's going to work his way from 1905 to the present. Is that the fun we've been promised? All I can say is that the total number of stops on the time machine is something like 4. So what are my intentions then? Well, my plan is to show that Alberta's bipolarity never really stopped after it got going in 1905. But in so doing, I have to acknowledge that the goalposts for political sanity versus insanity aren't where they used to be. They aren't even where they were when I started writing this presentation. What followed the 2016 election of U.S. President Donald Trump has been a period of political strangeness, unprecedented really, unless you include AD 37 to 41 when Caligula was emperor of the Roman Empire. So I apologize if the Alberta foibles I talk about this morning seem meek by Trump's or Caligula's standard. Alberta has never threatened to build a wall on any of its borders, nor has it declared war on Neptune. When Peter Lougheed and Pierre Trudeau did battle in the 70s, Peter never suggested Pierre be locked up, nor did he threaten the Prime Minister with fire and fury like he'd never seen. Peter Lougheed did threaten that Pierre Trudeau's federal Canada would have to pay the world price for Alberta oil, and that was frightening enough at the time. I think it was something like $10 a barrel that we were demanding, not what we were getting. I think we were getting about $1.50 or something. So anyway, it's noteworthy that that's about what we're getting now without inflation adjustment. But the closest Alberta ever came to a bizarreness similar to Mr. Trump, was when William Aberhart led the Social Credit Party of Alberta to power in 1935. Now, I decided I'm always envious of the people who have the PowerPoints, and people always ask me, will you be having a PowerPoint? And I think, oh, I don't think so. So I say no, but then I come to the conference and I see everybody's nice PowerPoint, and I think, wouldn't that be great? So what I'm going to ask you to do is, I'll just ask you to imagine certain things. So I'll just point up, and so William Aberhart was a very tall, biggish man with a bald head, and very round bald head, and little wire glasses. So there he is up there. So the timing was the Great Depression, and Albertans were probably justified in thinking traditional politics had simply failed. I think they were right. Time to branch out in search of something better. So in 1933, the Crow's Nest Pass mining town of Blairmore showed leadership in this regard by electing an all-communist town council. And the council renamed Blairmore's Main Street Timbuk Boulevard after the jailed national leader of the Canadian Communist Party. And interestingly, less than a year before that, Timbuk, somebody shot at him, and there's still a debate about who it was. Lots of people would have liked to see him dead. But while he was in jail during a prison riot, he was doing nothing. He was just hiding in his cell, and somebody came and took a couple of shots at him. At the start of the Depression, William Aberhart was principal of Calgary's Crescent Heights High School. He was also a Baptist preacher whose Sunday afternoon sermons were broadcast across Canada on Calgary's CFCN radio. CFCN was at the time the most widely listened to radio station west of Montreal. It sounds weird, but that's what I read. Because Aberhart's Sunday congregations were so large, he moved them to his own prophetic Bible Institute on 8th Avenue and 5th Street in downtown Calgary. The story goes that what goaded Bill Aberhart into politics was the suicide of a student whose family had fallen on hard times. Searching for a solution to the economic depression, Aberhart discovered the political teachings of Scotland's Major Douglas. In order to show you that Major Douglas's social credit economics system was hard to understand, my original intention was to read you his A+B theorem on purchasing power and debt, but I've decided to save you that. It's something about manipulating the money supply to put more purchasing power into people's hands, something like that. So in Aberhart's version, social credit meant that Alberta would no longer have conventional bank savings. At the end of each year, they would convert any money left over into provincial bonds. If people refused to do this, the savings would simply be confiscated. Now, at the end of their lives, Albertans with these social credit savings bonds the bonds would simply expire. Mr. Aberhart sought to replace the Canadian dollar in Alberta with his own prosperity certificates. This would free Alberta from tyranny of the federal government and the Canadian banks. So in his radio broadcasts, Bible Bill spoke of poverty in the midst of plenty. He voiced little skits in which a man from Mars comes to Earth, specifically to Alberta, and marvels at all the poverty, given the number of Albertans sitting on bags of cash. And here's an example from one of the Man from Mars skits. And this is the Man from Mars talking. "Now, sir, I find a very interesting feature here that you call money. It seems to be a very scarce article. It is this scarcity, the orthodox economist has told me, that causes the lack of purchasing power. Tell me, which government has control of this money?" Another feature of Aberhart's social credit shows were Abe and Joe, who were owners of of the two bars in a small Alberta town. So see the cartoon of a small main street and with two bars facing each other across the street. So to show how money circulation creates wealth, Eberhard described what would happen if he gave some money to one of those barkeeps. He imagines Joe running across the street and buying a glass of beer from Abe. Then Abe would take the money out of his till and run across the street and buy a glass of beer from Joe, and so on all day. In this way, an original investment of 10 cents could multiply the amount of business done in the town into several dollars. This sounds kind of like, I was an economics major at the University of Calgary at one time, and sounds a bit like the multiplier effect, but I think there was a little more to it than that. But I have to say, it sounds naive and simple and all that, but it's no dumber than what Trump's been saying about international trade. I mean, the idea he has that you have to win every single, like your trade balance with every single country, you have to win that, or the world's beaten up on you. Anyway, Eberhard created the Alberta Social Credit Party to contest the provincial election of 1935, but he left himself on the sidelines. He wanted to hang on to his school principal gig in case the political thing didn't work out. But Social Credit won, and it won by a landslide, 56 out of 63 seats. When Bible Bill was sure it was financially safe, he accepted the party leadership, and a seat was arranged for him by acclamation. So economically depressed Albertans were really eager to get their hands on the $25 a month that Eberhard had promised during his campaign. That, above all else, was the basis of his success and his victory. When he got into office, Eberhard looked inside the Alberta Treasury and found that it was bare. Wealthy Albertans had cashed their Alberta bonds and got their money the hell out of Alberta to avoid Eberhard's promised seizures. To keep the province running, Eberhard first had to go to the hated banks that he'd been vilifying in his speeches. And not being stupid, they refused him. And then he went to the federal government, and I could just imagine the immense smugness, of an irony of the federal government giving this Alberta Revolutionary Government emergency funding. But when Mr. Eberhard finally did churn out his first prosperity certificates, almost no Alberta stores would take them. Eberhard's own government wouldn't accept them for payment of taxes. There were a few other setbacks. For example, Social Credit's party whip, a Mr. Brown, I believe his name was charged with libel and counseling murder because he had suggested the extermination of 9 prominent Albertans who his party had dubbed bankers' toadies. So like Mr. Trump, Bible Bill hated how he and his party were perceived and depicted in the press. He passed a press gag law that insisted all Alberta newspapers publish exactly what his government said and wrote. He also notified the press that they must reveal their sources upon demand. If a reporter refused to comply with any of this, the government would charge $1,000 a day until that person or that paper came around. So after the press gag law was applied, Alberta news scribes were pretty much obliged to write disparaging things about Eberhard and his government every day, lest they appear cowardly. The Edmonton Journal led the rebellion, but other Alberta dailies and weeklies also rebelled. The Pulitzer Prize people in the U.S. took notice and in 1938 awarded the Edmonton Journal a plaque for their fight for press freedom. The Pulitzer also gave certificates to 50 other Alberta newspapers. So in the end, most of Eberhard's plans didn't fly. the Supreme Court and the federal government found almost all social credit legislation illegal, implausible, impossible. It seemed that Eberhard was mocked on every side, except one. The voters of Alberta. In the provincial election of 1940, social credit did lose some seats, but still had a comfortable majority at the end of the day. So Eberhard retired, I think it was in the early 40s, and was replaced by his protege, Ernest Manning. And all total, social credit ran Alberta for 36 uninterrupted years until Peter Lougheed defeated them in 1971. And actually, I'll just add a kind of an important thing there. Anybody that's read Brian Brennan's book about Ernest Manning would certainly know this, but that, you know, Socreds still weren't doing that poorly, even when, you know, when Peter Lougheed had his six-man opposition for a few years. And it was really only when Ernest Manning retired, a couple of years before, I guess it was 68 when he retired, and it was 71 when Lougheed won the landslide victory. So one wonders if Manning had hung on, if Lougheed would have gotten in when he did. So next stop on the tour is the amazing rise of Ralph Klein. When Ralph Klein ran for mayor of Calgary in 1980, it surprised a lot of us. I was a Calgarian at the time. He was familiar to Calgarians, including myself, as a regular on-camera news reporter for CFCN. He had the city, the city council beat. Decent-seeming fellow, got the job done, nothing spectacular. I confess I was not one of those who could look at him and see great political potential. Anything I did know about Klein beyond the obvious came from my filmmaking friends who had worked with Ralph at CTV. They told me that Klein was famous among reporters who covered City Hall for knowing in-camera decisions before they were publicly released. How was he doing it? Who could possibly be telling him? And finally, to a few of his friends, he divulged the secret. In the old City Hall, Calgary's old City Hall, the council chamber had a rounded back wall. The chamber fit tightly into the rectangular building. So between the outer wall of the building and the rounded back of the council chamber, there was a space. And in the wall that covered that space, there was a ventilation screen. And Ralph had discovered that if he removed the screen and wrestled his way in, and he was a pretty rotund guy even then, he could put his ear to the council chamber wall and hear quite clearly what was going on in there. Then suddenly, Ralph was mayor. He would win 3 elections as mayor before moving on to provincial politics. Mayor Klein was famous for taking his lunches in the St. Louis Hotel's basement tavern. And I was familiar with the Louis in those days, and it was at any time of day or night a really raw, raucous Alberta tavern. Ralph always went there with his chief of staff and best buddy, Rod Love, and so he could defend the St. Louis lunches as working lunches. In his early years in politics, he would, if pressed, say that he was a kind of liberal. But in not too long, he started not sounding much like one. In the late 70s, Alberta was doing much better than the rest of Canada, and lots of men from, mostly men, from Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes were pouring into Edmonton and Calgary, hoping to get oil jobs. And in 1981, when the international oil bubble burst, and the oil price collapsed back to around $10 a barrel, a lot of these men lost their jobs, but more still kept coming. In January '82, Ralph referred to the unemployed Easterners as creeps and bums, and blamed them for increased crime in his city. This got him on the CBC National News, the Knowlton News. So I'll ask you to view the video clip above from the archives of the CVC, in which Ralph is kind of an apple-cheeked, quite young-looking man, I have to say, with a sort of little Beatles haircut in a way, and he's looking tough, and Knowlton, of course, with his round glasses and big eyes. So Knowlton repeated the Creeps and Bums quote, and Ralph said, "What I said was kick ass." Sounding like a cracker sheriff in an American movie, he explained that men coming to Calgary for work had 2 weeks to find it. If they didn't, they should get out of town. He finished off by saying he wouldn't be too upset if he heard his city policeman had roughed up a few of these guys to encourage them to go. Not a very liberal sentiment. So a decade later, Ralph had switched to provincial politics, the Progressive Conservative Party of Alberta. After a short while, he was, as a cabinet minister, he became leader of the party. Somewhere in there, jolly old Ralph seemed to have turned into a combination of Milton Friedman, Ayn Rand, Margaret Thatcher, and Ronald Reagan. His obsession as premier was the provincial deficit. The oil price was still around $10 and Alberta's economy was sucking. What Ralph did next was the exact reverse of what economists advise in a recession. He started canning teachers, nurses, and every other kind of Alberta public servant. The exclamation mark on all of this was when he blew up the Calgary's General Hospital. Or actually, the press were really funny because they would say blow up, and they would always, in parenthesis afterwards, say it was actually an implosion, not an explosion, an implosion. And I remember Ralph had made sure that he had a ringside seat, like he was within a block, so he could watch, watch it come down. So his approach made the recession more depression-like, and over the course of his career as premier, Ralph delivered balanced budgets by creating massive infrastructure deficits, most of which the NDP government are stuck with today. Why does our hospital's roof leak? You'll hear it's Rachel's fault, but really it's Ralph's. In 1996, Premier Klein and Prime Minister Chrétien got together on a plan to revitalize the moribund Alberta oil sands. They came up with a package of incentives for anyone willing to invest in the oil sands, including royalties that would stay at 1% until a project paid out. The top end of our royalties was somewhere around 25%, and that was considered low by world standards, but 1% until payout, it certainly did bring the money in. I'll grant that. Because this 1% absurdity is still on Alberta's books, I wrote in Alberta Views in one of my columns not too long ago to describe how such a scheme might work if it was applied to my business, the business of writing books, and I'll read from that column now. I think the idea of 1% until payout is an excellent one, and my only complaint is that writers of books aren't on the same system. With the 1% royalty for oil sands projects, the government recognized that such projects take a long time to build. Costs could go up, setbacks could be frequent. The price of the product fluctuates. The book writing business is actually very like that. Books take years to write. Unforeseen obstacles emerge, and the whole time you're working on a book, you don't know if anyone will want to publish or buy it. If I had some kind of 1% deal with the government, say a 1% income tax, until my project paid out, I imagine that things might go like this. I'd give the government an estimated time of completion and would go to work on my novel. I'd be working in my factory, which is to say my home office. After a year, a government representative would call and ask how it was coming. I'd tell him that it had started out well until I realized I couldn't work to my full capacity in my home office. It's a small room that I share with a piano. So I went ahead and took out a wall to combine my office and the boot room. This meant that for a time I had to rent an office outside the home. All in all, project costs have risen, and I'm afraid the length of time until payout has also risen by 6 months at least. When the government chap visits after the second year, I tell him the book is advancing nicely. I'm up to 10% of completion. However, I realized that I was getting a little stale, so I flew down to Toronto to see my publisher. Then, to further refresh myself, I rented a cottage in the Muskokas, where I have to say rents have gone through the roof. In the cottage, I began to progress really well until I had a slight boating accident. Broke a femur. That put a hole in my schedule, but to keep the project from standing still, I hired a research assistant, and the materials she found was excellent, but of course it came at a cost. So I have to report that I'm now 12 months further behind on payout. It's just madness. I mean, a good accountant could make sure those projects never pay out. But with money flooding into Alberta's oil sands, and I should check where I am. Money was flowing in there to the incentive plan. The 1% aspect of things went unnoticed because, you know, individuals and construction companies were getting jobs. That was the main thing. And finally, the world oil price had started to creep up. So besides the 1% royalty, the thing that made the oil sands incentive work so well was that the largest oil companies in the world had been holding on to cash for years. Low oil prices in an unsettled world meant there wasn't much of anywhere for big oil to safely invest. The oil price bust that started in 1981 lasted into the 1990s. So the amount of money the mega corporations were sitting on was vast. Like, this is really ironic, but, you know, even though prices were low, you know, they were still making a whack of money because, and it accumulated because they wouldn't invest it. But here was Alberta, a safe province and a safe country with a giant resource and a very reasonable tax and royalty conditions. Alberta and Ottawa's oil sands strategy was an instant booming success. And Ralph, thanks to gouging 20% out of Alberta's cost of government, was running surpluses. Albertans, those not put out of work by Ralph, looked upon him as a debt slayer and a bringer of rain, hero of the day. In the 2000s, the surplus situation got out of hand. Alberta's resource revenue from oil topped $10 billion several years in a row. Sometimes Ralph didn't know what to do with the money. Way back when Alberta had its last oil boom in the 1970s, Peter Lougheed had created the Alberta Heritage Fund, a rainy day fund that recognized that Alberta oil was a finite resource from which future generations might not benefit. Future Albertans could use the Heritage Fund when those days rolled around. But after Mr. Lougheed seeded the fund with about $8 billion, oil prices started to slide and not much money went in. After Lougheed retired, Alberta was often short of money for this and that, and the governments of the day began dipping into the Heritage Fund. They also made terrible investments. More or less, the fund ceased to grow. In the late 90s, when Alberta started to have surplus money again, some suggested it was time to start contributing to the Heritage Fund again. Other resource economies had started to have funds. For example, in 1990, Norway began putting its excess North Sea billions into the Norway Petroleum Fund, but somehow or another, Ralph was not interested in the Heritage Fund. It must have gone against the Thatcherite, Reaganite, Randite, Friedmanite manifestos. For whatever reason, Ralph would not save. In 2005, Ralph proved that he would do anything to avoid saving money. He looked at that year's fat government surplus and decided to give a personal gift to all Albertans, $400 a head. And I devoted an Alberta Views column to the subject of Ralph Bucks. I called it The Parable of the King and the Giant Surplus. This, slightly rewritten, is that column. The king of all Blotto looks out the window and sees that all was good. The kingdom's coffers overflowed from oil exports, and everyone was asking him what he would do with the money. That was the king's only quandary, what to give the kingdom that has everything. Every day, courtiers arrived bearing gifts, wanting bigger gifts in return. It was a tiresome parade. Today's first visitor, entering by a special side door, was a representative of the Bigger, Cleaner, Happier World Corporation, who recommended the king that a 10-year corporate tax holiday would be an excellent gift to the citizens. The king's Yale chorus of free market economists jumped to their feet at that. They flapped their ears and double-kicked their hind hooves. "Eliminate taxes," they brayed. "Free the market." But the old king wasn't sure. He groped in his dressing gown for his cigarettes before remembering that he no longer smoked. Why take less money when you can take more, he was thinking. He sent the Bigger, Cleaner courtier packing. When next there was a tap on the door and the king's chief of staff opened it, a pathetic group of artists peeped in. They tried to cross the threshold, but the king and his chief of staff roared them back. "You again. Didn't we give you money in 1984? Several of the artists had books in their hands, all Blotto-authored books that they said had won national awards. But the king asked his chief to please run them off. They tried to leave the books behind, but the chief wouldn't let them. "What do you expect your king to do with those?" Then a louder rap, and wouldn't you know it, it was a crowd of the poor. Parents of too many children, children of too few parents, spouses of spouses addicted to government VLTs. Every one of them had failed to learn how to use the all Blotto advantage. The chief was going to slam the door on them, but the old king stopped him. The king's good opinion of himself was based on believing he was kind, so he let the crowd of the poor enter. And then it came to him, a way to get rid of the damnable surplus. This minute, he would declare a program called the King of All Blotto Prosperity Certificates. He described his plan to the room full of poor. "It's worth $400, $400 for you, $400 for your spouse, $400 for each of your children, a gift from me, your king." Toothlessly, the poor smiled at the king. Some actually salivated. Chief of staff was silent in shock. The Yale free market economists were extremely upset and were attempting to chase the poor away. When everyone was finally gone from the room, the king asked the chief of staff how much money the certificates would get rid of. The king punched at his calculator for a minute and said, $1.3 billion. "Oh no," said the king, slumping back to his throne, "another $10 billion to go." As for the Alberta Heritage Fund, it still exists. Having started out at $8 billion in 1976, it rose to just below $25 billion in 1980, and today, 38 years after Peter Lougheed put in the first money, it stands at $17.6 billion. Meanwhile, Norway's petroleum fund recently topped $1 trillion. I'm just going to see. A few more minutes. I'll just stop whenever it's time. So does any of this add up to an understanding of Alberta? It's a good question. And maybe for the next bit, I'll ignore the fact that the old Alberta isn't the only Alberta, that Alberta has become a highly urbanized, multiracial, multicultural province, and therefore he who generalizes based on history risks being wrong. But for some reason, when I go to the coffee shop or to the A&W for breakfast, I run into the old Alberta immediately, the one that hasn't changed much since I was a child. These Albertans have various mythologies about themselves, that they are self-reliant individualists, hard-working, hard-nosed, competitive, yet also generous, fun-loving, and humorous. And I'll grant that most of that is true. Besides these images, I'll add a few generalizations of my own. Albertans can be tremendously suspicious, touchy, and opinionated. About our opinionation, I used to say that I was going to have 100 medals made that read, "I don't know." Every time I heard an Albertan say those words, I would give him or her a medal. I was fairly sure my supply of 100 medals would be enough to last my lifetime. If you want to turn Albertans into enemies, the quickest way is to blame them for something. I've heard a dozen reasons why Jim Prentice led the PCA to defeat in 2015, that Rachel Notley was smarter and quicker on her feet, which is true, and that she won the televised debate by TKO. Again, I agree. The fact that we were tired of the same party after 44 years. But I think the tables actually turned the day Jim Prentice told Albertans to look in the mirror. Look in the mirror for the answer to why Alberta is financially in trouble. The hue and cry that followed this was deafening. How dare Jim Prentice blame Albertans for the economy? Whatever was wrong with Albertans, it damn well wasn't our fault. That was the moment. Similarly, you can't tax Albertans. They won't stand for it. Witness the present situation with the carbon tax. Outrage. To hear the talk at the A&W where the old people, including me, enjoy the cheapest breakfast in town, the carbon tax is pushing them to the very edge. The same group is there every day. It's $70 a week just for breakfast. But the latest carbon tax increase, a couple of cents per liter of gas, $5 a month on average, added to their home heating, killing them. It's killing them. So, I mean, you know, the only places that don't have a personal sales tax in Canada are Alberta and Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. And I would say that the northern places have a reason. I mean, they don't have that many people, and the prices are already over the moon. But Alberta's case, damning any political party that as much as suggests a sales tax, is unique. One thing Alberta's NDP knew for certain when they prepared for 2015 was that they must not mention a provincial sales tax. No sales tax and low tax rates all around were what Ralph called the Alberta advantage. Low income tax and corporate tax and no sales tax is alluring to people and businesses from out of province and out of country. The lack of a sales tax also means that folks from the BC side of the Alberta-BC border slip across and shop in places like Pincher Creek. The only problem with all that is every time the world oil price falls off a cliff, Alberta is instantly both in an income and a debt crisis. So what this means is that if the world does get serious about leaving oil behind, Alberta will be insolvent, a basket case. A common feature of European countries deep in debt, for example, Greece, is that people won't pay their taxes. It was an amazing article I read. Not just them, but just about all the other countries that are deep, deep in debt. People just don't pay their taxes. And I would submit that not paying taxes and not having taxes is basically the same thing, in effect. But if that happens, if Alberta becomes a basket case, you'd better not tell us to look in the mirror. That's one thing. Yeah. All right. I'm just looking for a good out place here. Yeah. Well, I do have this one little part. So since you can't blame them and you can't tax them, you know, and that is related to the fact that there are so many climate change deniers to be found in Alberta. Because, like, if you were to tell Albertans that 97% of credible scientists agree that human-caused climate change is real, and that the scientists further agree that it's caused by farting cows in Africa, they might accept it. They might give money to build a building with their name on it dedicated to fighting African cattle fart climate change. But tell them that climate change is caused by burning fossil fuels for transportation and heat, and that as Albertans we cause the problem more than other people, you'll get a different reaction. For that sounds very like blaming Alberta and Albertans for climate change. Okay, there we go. All right. So one final word, I just say that if there's one historical trend in Alberta that I hope will continue, it's that I would look at the one where Alberta Social Credit ruled Alberta for 36 years and the Progressive Conservatives ruled for 44 years. So by that token, the Alberta NDP can look forward to at least 3 more decades to set this province straight. So, thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Fred. That was very interesting and funny, and it's an interesting tension. So we have a lot of time now for some collective participatory discussion. I think we have 2 mics, or 1 mic. Mic people? 1 mic? Okay. So, we do have two mics. So I'd ask you to put your hand up if you'd like to speak, and also to please frame what you have to say into a question, and maybe keep like extensive comments till later, to give a chance for more and diverse people to speak. Okay, so, yep.
Mr. Stenson, I'm just wondering if you know how soon after Mr. Klein came to become mayor of Calgary did he attend to the ventilation issue?
Very good question. Well, he did in a sense because they built a new city hall. So I should go to the new city hall and check what's outside the back wall. Yeah.
When you wrote Who by Fire in 2014, did you happen to do any research with Ludwig, the neighbor across the border?
I'm sorry, with who?
Ludwig.
Oh, Weibo?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting. And one of the things that actually prompted me, I think, to write Who by Fire, which is somewhat based on my family's experience of dealing with a frontier sour gas plant in southwestern Alberta that didn't work at all well. But I think one of the times I remember I was at a party and someone was talking about Andrew Nikiforik's book about Weibo Ludwig, and which I had reviewed, and I guess somehow it was reading that book and some kind of derogatory statements, because during the book review I wrote in Alberta Views, I had used my own experience, because that book really astounded me, because I must confess I thought a lot of those problems had been solved over the decades. And to read what was going on with that family in that area, releases of raw sour gas and that sort of thing, I just thought, and then the fact that they used to come to his place and ask him after a particularly bad night, were they okay? And as a child, I remember when they would do that. They'd come down from the plant and ask, and I thought, what are they asking? Like, are we still alive? Is that they just checking to see if we're dead or not? I mean, I wasn't quite sure what benefit having them visit the next morning was actually giving us, But the fact that it was still going on made me realize that story wasn't over, and that maybe that story was something I could write. Did that sort of answer your question?
I have a related question, because I've read your book, Who by Fire, but we are also on the Rural Caucus, the NDP Rural Caucus.
Yeah.
And after we won in 2015, we started to hear stories. And we've been on the caucus for about 4 years, but it wasn't until we won that we started to hear stories from the Alberta countryside.
Mm-hmm.
And they were very shocking,
Yeah.
very upsetting. During the mad cow disease, my brother in Saskatchewan said they were selling beef across the border. I thought my brother was crazy. And then farmers started saying, no, they were,
Yeah.
and told us the whole routine. But my question is, I started to realize that out in the country, there are all sorts of people who have been screwed or destroyed or poisoned or tricked into signing non-disclosure agreements. And so what about the part of Alberta that has been silenced but is full of rage and has lived with injustice for 40 years? Like, that's the part I'm curious about, how those rural people have managed to continue not wanting to look in the mirror, or managed to continue being Albertans.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's an interesting thing. The people who were affected, I know that most of those people are dead now that were adults at the time. But their children who remained there are some of the smartest, most politicized, most organized people that I know. And so how they dealt with it is well, my sister's a really good example. She went back to the farm and she lives there, still in the shadow of this tiny little polyp of an old plant that was our nemesis when we were kids. And I mean, she and my other sister Marie and myself and a group of these really well politicized, well educated farm people, we took on there was a plant that was going to be built on that same site by a company called Evex that was going to be using like hydrochloric acid and really powerful bases, in barrels to take old mine rock from BC and basically melt it down to get at the remaining bits of gold and silver and so on. And now with the help of a philanthropist who, somebody I knew when I was young, who provided money for a lawyer. And we didn't win, but when this company, there were 34 conditions for this company to go on, and they gave up instantly. And so you see, that's the fallout. Is a generation later, we're better educated and we're not as nervous around the political apparatus, and it is possible to get some wins. So in a way, I mean, it is a funny thing. I've never understood why farmers and oilmen vote for the same political party. That's been going on since 1935. And I'm not sure. It's not 100%. I know Liberals and NDP people from down there, obviously. But, I mean, they've controlled, politically, what shows up on the sheet is that we support the same political. It makes no sense. And, I mean, we used to, at least when I was a kid, my parents understood that those were their enemies. However pleasant they might be when they come down for coffee, they were still our enemies. We understood it.
They understand that on rural coffee.
Yeah. Okay, so, yeah. Well, and I think what really made a big difference, too, is that a lot of quite well-off people, often having made their money off of the oil industry and looking for a place to retire, would, wanting a rural acreage, wound up living in areas that were fracked, that they didn't expect to be fracked, that were fracked. And so, again, those people found themselves on the other side of the fence, and because of their knowledge and so on, they tend to be very, very good advocates. And so if we could just keep on having the government we have, I think we'd actually find that we could redress a lot of these things, particularly just by having, you know, a wider spectrum of interveners allowed, you know, and maybe get rid of the stupid oil paid for AG in favor of something else. But, you know, I think there really is a lot of power in the country. So I had a bunch more in this talk that I don't have time to deliver about, you know, the beliefs out there and how they don't make sense to me. And I can't believe, you know, I run into all, I go home, I go to a wedding, a funeral, I mean, I run into all those views still. And from coming out of the mouths of some of the nicest people I know and people I would trust more than just about anybody if I was in trouble. I don't know why they think what they think.
Thank you. Thank you for making our morning worth getting up for today. You mentioned that Alberta didn't build a wall, but we did have a firewall letter
Yes.
signed by somebody that we elected as a prime minister.
Boy, yeah. That, I tell you, that firewall letter, in particular the list of people that signed it at the bottom, I mean, if you follow the careers of those people, you find, I mean, I went digging for dirt on that group, and man, there's a lot of it there, you know. I mean, they've had some really screwy careers. I mean, that one fellow was, you know, was Christy Clark's chief of staff in BC, and he was forced to quit over indiscretion of the kind that are very common now amongst conservatives. It's yeah, but yeah, and I mean, like I'm all of a sudden a little like I've got a rock in my mouth because these people are litigious as hell. But you know, but really, you know, just Google that list of names and see where some of those folks wound up and what they're in control of. You know, it's a weird array. Stephen Harper might have been one of the less weird, though that's hard to believe. But yeah, no, that was a real signifier. But I think we always have to remember that was simply a letter signed by, you know, 5 people that one of whom went on to be prime minister. I don't think it really, you know, I don't think we were ever really fully clear who they represented. I mean, I remember feeling like a separatist in some of those periods of time. About the time when, you know, when Pierre Trudeau was giving the finger to grain farmers in Saskatchewan, and I was a little upset myself, you know. But, you know, cooler heads prevailed. But, yeah, so interesting.
Hi. With respect to your surprise that the farmers and the oil people vote for the same government, Albertans, especially if you came from a farm like I did, are not really out looking for trouble. And when industry comes to town, it's not necessarily viewed as a bad thing.
No.
But some of the nasty things that oil companies have done, they're starting to smarten up and avoid. Now, the oil companies have a long time ago cottoned on to this. More than 12 years ago, the Canadian Petroleum Producers Association got thinking on how are we going to do better PR. And guess what? They went to one of the biggest PR outfits, Hill and Knowlton.
Yeah.
And they started up in Alberta, at least, something they call a synergy seminar once every year. And they pay the way of people who are in the emergency planning zones of wells.
Right.
They pay their representatives to come and take part in this love-in in Red Deer at the Capri. And they have lots of good stories to tell each other about their hopes to minimize the impact on people. And to a large degree, it is successful.
Mm-hmm.
When it isn't, you might take the approach that we did in Great Lake, Alberta, where 52 cabin owners, containing an awful lot of very intelligent people, would launch an intervention which with each of the 3 sour gas wells that were installed. When you do that, and you're in the emergency planning zone, they have to pay your lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
You go to it, and then an intervention, if you get to it, it will cost you $3-4 million of the oil company money,
Right.
and then you're going to lose anyway because 97% of the applications get approved.
Mm-hmm.
But that's where you engage in a little bit of subterfuge. You go to the company and say, look, let's sit down and how can we save you a few $1 million? There are certain things you can do for us.
Mm-hmm.
Put shut-off valves closer together. So
Yeah.
if there's an escape, less gas gets out.
Mm-hmm.
Give us an alarm in our subdivision. And they put in a sniffer in our subdivision run by solar power that detects any minute amount of sour gas getting down to us.
Mm-hmm.
And there's various ways, but the oil company's way ahead of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm answering the question as to how it is that these farmers and
Yeah.
you
No.
get along with
Thank you
politicians.
very much. Yeah.
I had a question here. I wanted to know whether you were aware of the fact that the Responsible Energy Development Act in 2013 removed what the EUB and the ERCB had to do, which was make decisions in the public interest. The Alberta Energy Regulator does not have to make decisions in the public interest, and since they're 100% industry funded and a corporation and not beholding to the Crown, I don't think I could share your optimism about the shift. There are no more interveners. I live in a rural area. That's all changed.
Yeah. I thought, well, actually, I wish Andrew Nikifor could just answer some of these questions because I think he knows so much more about this than I do. But yeah, I thought there had been at least a promise or a suggestion of change in intervener status. Okay.
Hi, Fred Judson. Another Fred. So my question is, given our need for humoristic relief within the realities we're all living is, could you take a few riffing cuts at the man who's likely to be the premier in this province, please?
Well, I'd love to. I spend too much time on Twitter, but what I do there, I mean, Kenny seems to be there about, 12 hours a day. I mean, honestly, I can't believe how much time he spends submitting to Twitter. And I mean, if in fact Twitter is sort of politically useless, I love this, which a lot of people think it is. He's certainly wasting a lot of his time, which I love to see. But yeah, I mean, it is imitating Trump. It is an imitation of Trump. This idea, like it has caught on with Ford and all these guys. There they are parading their ignorance in a way on Twitter, and I wish, in fact, more people could witness it because they get savaged all the time by very bright, funny people. But yeah.
Question, and because I already feel so much better having been listening to you for just a short time. I think if you look at the United States, they have people like Trevor Noah who came from South Africa, and he's doing a great job.
Yes.
We have you. We should have you as the Ministry of Laughter.
Right on, and I could use the job too. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, that sounds like a great place to stop. No, go ahead.
I was wondering why you didn't make one of your stops on the history of Alberta, the period of the UFA.
Oh, the UFA, right. Well, I thought UFA kind of was good, just simple good government. I didn't see too much to make fun of there. I mean, of course, it ended badly with the sexual thing at the end of, which guy was that? Brownlee, yeah. Brownlee's indiscretion. He went the Tony Clement way. Not quite. There was no sex and no photographs, no. But yeah, but did you have a specific part of the UFA story that you thought would have been good? Yeah, yeah. Well, it is interesting. I mean, starting out as with a Liberal government, then going to UFA. I mean, everything really. We started out so sensibly, but it really was the Depression, I think, and just the loss of faith in anything that people. They looked at the governments of the day, not unlike what's going to be happening soon to all of us, or it's probably happening already, is I think, frankly, what Justin Trudeau faces right now is partly just a kind of an overall disgust at the slowness and the cautiousness of government. And it's the practicalities of governing that's put Rachel Notley's government into under suspicion from its own base. I mean, I can't hardly get through a day without running into somebody that's mad at Rachel Notley for the support of the oil industry. But I mean, political practicality. They want to get elected again, but. So it's democracy is really under intense pressure. I'm astounded at the intensity of pressure it's under right now, because with these problems hoving on the horizons, I mean, democracy's so slow. Well, it's not just Alberta. I don't think we understand democracy very well in Canada. Most of the free world is governed by coalitions. This two-party, three-party, 2.5-party systems that we have in North America are really a primitive approach to democracy. Coalitions are just so much better. I mean, in that, the first past the post is another piece of ridiculousness, of course. But we just don't deal, our systems are very cumbersome and very slow and very awkward and more exclusive than inclusive. And we got to smarten up fast.
Hey, Fred. Just want to say thanks. Loved that PowerPoint this morning. It was a great way to start a Sunday.
I'm kind of done with this. I can't seem to see the people who are speaking. Oh, okay. Go ahead.
You started describing Albertans, and this is a great segue as you've talked about the two-party, and that this rise of populists, and it's not just Alberta or Canada, it's worldwide now.
Yeah.
What I'd like your opinions on here, as we look forward, there are folks in this room that are pushing hard to defend their health care, to defend their education, and there's somehow, as we've seen in this weekend's events, a disconnect, that Albertans aren't seeing the threat that's truly coming towards their health care and education in this populist uprising that's coming. And please put something funny as a spin on it, because I sure need it today.
Yeah, you could leave it. Well, I mean, it is an absolutely remarkable thing that people want the services and don't want to pay for them. But I think the thing is, you know, we went through such a long period. I mean, when I look at how fast we blew off our conventional oil and how little, you know, we have to show for it, it's just incredible. I mean, that's a resource carefully cared for, and you know, I mean, that should have, the conventional oil and gas should have lasted, I don't know, 100 years longer than it did. And I think that it just created the idea, and I think it is a kind of a Friedmanite, Thatcherite, Ayn Randite type reasoning that's responsible, that somehow you don't need government, you know, and that everything would be better if it was done privately. And I think sometimes these people, up to the point in time when they actually would have to pay the private doctor or the private surgeon the huge amount of money that they do in the States, up to that minute, I think that's when it might, if there's a penny ever going to drop in those people, it would drop then. But I think they also kind of believe that, well, we could go to some other place and get it done. So, I mean, you've got all sorts of tourism, medicine going on, of course. But it is very hard to understand. I mean, yeah, the hospitals thing, I know, and I know some entrepreneurs, very wealthy people, and boy, they get frustrated when they can't get into their local hospital, and they wind up, you know, 100 miles away or 100 kilometers away. You know, I just think, well, what do you think was going to happen? You know, like there is something, there's just a resistance to reality that's, and it's funny, I'll tell you a little anecdote that I think, I remember I was doing a book for the gas processing industry, history of the gas processing industry of Canada. And these guys, all of whom had been presidents and vice presidents and of big oil companies, big gas companies, and they were sitting around and they were going on and on about free enterprise, and one of them sort of made a crack like, well, you know, there's got to be a lot of surplus funds, you know, for people like Fred, you know. And I blew my top, you know. I said, I am the only free enterpriser in the room. I wake up every day and try and figure out how to make my living. You know, I have to be clever. I have to have a gazillion clients. I have to, you know, stretch myself all over the place to try and find a living. You guys, I said, you know, the government tells you where you can drill. The government tells you how much you can sell. It tells you what pipe you're going to put it in. It tells you, you know, what percentage of everything. You know, at what point do you guys ever make a free enterprise decision? Ever. You know.
I haven't read all your work, but I do have a question whether you've done this idea, or I'll offer it to you. I feel like this time is kind of like the wall came down in Germany, and comparing after 44 years of how Western Germany re-educated its population to be never again under authoritarian rule. And they had to do it all over again with the Eastern side. And I really feel that's what we are living with right now in Alberta.
That's a terrific analogy. Yeah,
because it's not about whether people know about parties. 4 generations of grade 12ers never saw a different change in color.
Yeah.
And 4 generations don't know what democracy is.
Yeah.
And the last thing about that is not about even political parties. It's just about prejudice. There's so endemic prejudice against being NDP outside of Edmonton because they only hear the gossip.
Yeah. Well, and you know, there is also the absurdity of team play. And I've been thinking about this over and over in my mind because I watch a lot of sports, you know, and You know, and I mean, last night, Battle of Alberta, Oilers in Calgary, and it really it gets me excited. And I'm not cheering for the Oilers, sorry, but the thing is, people have that. They have exactly the same attitude as to sports. You know, like there's Team Oil, there's Team Environment. You know, there's Team NDP, there's Team UCP. I mean, and the thing is, people kind of have this instinctual sense of which one they're on, and I don't think, other than that, they think about it all that much. They just know which side they're on, and they'll never go against that. So it's like all the guys I eat breakfast with every morning at the A&W. You know. 698, hard to beat. And, you know, I listen to them, and they know exactly what they don't like and what they like, you know, what team they're on, what team they're not on. And that's, I just think it's that simplistic. You know, we talk about so many other things that are so complex and minute and require a lot of intense thinking, and we bring a lot of structures and ways of studying into play. But basically, it is that simple. It's team this versus team that, and yeah, I find that's the biggest problem is you know, people, they don't want to switch teams because that's who they are, and yeah, so.
In addition to thanking Fred, I want to thank all of you for being here this morning and for raising some really great and provocative questions.